Okay, my name is James W. Seibert, S-I-B-E-R-T, and I reside at Fort Myers, Florida, where I've been retired since 1972. And the reason I was involved in the Kennedy assassination is in 1963, I was an agent assigned to the Baltimore division of the FBI, and I was the senior resident agent of the Hyattsville, Maryland resident agency that covered Andrews Air Force Base, where Air Force One was based. And since the body was flown back into Camp Springs, Maryland at Andrews Air Force Base, that's how I became involved.
So tell me, from the time that you heard that you were going to be involved, what did you do?
Well, this happened, of course, about noon on the 22nd, November 22nd of 1963. And we came back up to the office and turned on the standard radio broadcast and heard that the president had been shot in Dallas. We soon thereafter called the Andrews Air Force Base to find out what information they had. And they said that the Air Force One was going to be coming back in there that evening with the body. And after that, we notified Mr. Tully, who was my special agent in charge in Baltimore, that we were going out to Andrews to be there in the event that we were needed for any occasion, and that if he wanted to locate us, he could call and get us through the OSI, or the Office of Special Investigation, there at Andrews Air Force Base, and gave him the name of the officer, Colonel Best, that was in charge of that. So we went on out, and there was a delay in Air Force One coming back. They changed the time of arrival. And we were there when, and another thing I might state here, the reason we were there is that there were a lot of civilians on Andrews Air Force Base, and any kind of a state violation that occurs on a base, it automatically becomes under FBI jurisdiction. It becomes federal crime on a government reservation. So we would be there in that event, because the Bureau at that time had no investigative jurisdiction for investigating the assassination of a United States president. That came along in a law in 1965. So we were there, and it wasn't until Air Force One was in the traffic pattern that we received information through Mr. Tully that headquarters in the Bureau wanted us to get in the motorcade, go out to the to Bethesda, Maryland National Navy Medical Center, where the autopsy was going to be done, witness the autopsy, hand carry any bullets that might have been removed or anything like that from the body, and carry it over to the firearms section of the FBI lab to preserve the chain of evidence. So that was basically what our reason for being there. We witnessed the autopsy. O'Neill and I made notes. I told Frank, he was my alternate senior resident agent. I said, Frank, we want to get a listing of everybody that comes into this autopsy room tonight. So when we got there, we were in the third car of the motorcade. I might say that first out there at the tarmac at Andrews Air Force Base, I contacted Mr. Jim Rowley, who was the charge of the Secret Service, the same position comparable to Mr. Hoover with the FBI, told him what our instructions were, and Mr. Rowley put O'Neill and I in the third car of the motorcade, and we rode in the motorcade behind the Navy ambulance on out to Bethesda. On arrival there, I contacted Secret Service agent Roy Kellerman, Kellerman, who was in charge of the detail, told him that what we were supposed to do. He said he had already been informed by Raleigh that we were there, and O'Neill and I helped lift the casket out of the Navy ambulance. It was a gray Navy ambulance that had transported the casket out. We put it on a gurney and rolled it into the ante room of the autopsy room, and we started getting names of everyone that was in there, both medical and military personnel that came in there, and we recorded measurements made by the doctors during the autopsy. The only time that O'Neill and I, either one of us or both, weren't present in that autopsy room during the entire autopsy that started about 8 o'clock or 8:15 until it was terminated, was when we were all excluded when they cleared the room to do photographs and x-rays of the body. And from then on, one of us or both of us were there in the autopsy room. I left it at one time to call over to the Bureau. It was during the autopsy, and the wound in the back that Humes had located, and they had probed it with a chrome probe and couldn't find any exit at all or no evidence of any bullet. And I said, well, let me go and call over to headquarters, the firearms section, and see if by chance that there's any kind of an ice bullet or a bullet that would completely defragmentize, it wouldn't be an evidence of an X-ray or anything. So when I left, they had tight security, and they sent a Marine guard down with me to another room, and I used the phone there and called over to the firearms section. And I was able to contact Agent Killian, K-I-L-L-I-O-N, who I'd worked with in Baltimore prior to going down to Hyattsville. And he said, well, you heard about the bullet being found on the stretcher over in Parkland? I said, no, I haven't any information. What's the situation? He said, well, there was a bullet found on a stretcher. They don't know whether it was the president's or Connolly's, Governor Connolly's, and they're flying that into our firearms lab here. And so I went back and informed Commander Humes, the pathologist, of what I'd had. And at that time, he said, well, that probably accounted for it being worked out during cardiac massage over in Parkland there when they tried to resuscitate the president. And he also said that the president died due to this terrific, massive head wound in the back of the head. And that was it.
So tell me about from when the casket comes in. Tell me what happened at that point once the casket was...
All right, the casket, when it was carried in, was placed in this ante room that's just off of the regular autopsy room. I was there when they opened the casket right over the top of it, and the president's body was wrapped in white sheets, one sheet around the body, another sheet was around the head, and it was soaked with blood. This was due to this massive head wound. And when they took the sheets off, Commander Humes made the statement, well, there's an apparent tracheotomy because you could see in the anterior part of the neck where there was a slit there. And he said, and surgery of the head area. And because they had taken this off and there was a massive removal of, the bone was just missing from the back part of the head. And he attributed this maybe to head surgery. And as I say, this is one thing that I've always regretted. I might have been out of bounds asking it, but I thought since then, and there was books written making a mention of the surgery in the head area, when they flew in a piece of bone later on during the autopsy that had been found in the limousine that the president had been riding in there at Dallas, I thought if I'd had the presence of mind to ask Dr. Humes, well, now does this piece of bone change your mind any on surgery of the head? Could this have been what you were referring to as head surgery, where this piece that was blown out? But as I say, we had no jurisdiction there, and I might have been out of bounds even asking that question, since we had no jurisdiction in the matter.
So after that statement, the body's on the table and the head's on
the body then was the attendants there in the autopsy room, medical attendants placed the body on the autopsy table, And the autopsy wasn't started just then. After that, then they cleared us out for the photographs and the radiology work, x-rays. Then we came back in, and the actual autopsy, the first incision was made about 8 or 8:15. I don't recall which now.
So tell me what happened then. What do you remember about, do you remember any comments, the doctor's comments about, other than the surgery statement and the tracheotomy, do you remember any of the general discussion?
Well, one of the things that O'Neill and I both felt like, we came away from there feeling like that they were getting clearances from either from Admiral Berkeley, who was the president's personal physician who was there in the autopsy room. He was, I think, on the phone some of the time, and whether he was getting permission from either Jackie Kennedy or Robert Kennedy to proceed with the autopsy. And as I say, the conclusion was that there were a wound in the back that they couldn't account for the bullet, and then this wound in the head, in the top of the head, which was attributed to being the cause of death.
Now, when you say the top of the head, do you mean the top?
No, I mean this part right back there, and the, I guess the scallop part, and to the right side, a little to the right side. It wasn't in the mid part of the back, but right back here.
So take your hands and show me the dimensions as you
Well,
recall.
it was measured in centimeters that night, but it would be measured, and I converted that to 3.5 inches, one measurement, and about, I think, 2.5, something like that the other way. Quite a piece of bone. And another thing, too, that I recall, that there was massive blood in the hair, and it was all matted. Of course, the president had a heavy head of hair. And you had brain tissue there. As it was determined later, a lot of this was blown out, and the fact the motorcycle policeman riding on the left rear had it all over his clothing and everything. So it was quite a gory sight and quite a wound.
Well, now you were there from the very first, when the casket was brought in. You were there at the beginning, so when they took him out and they unwrapped the head, you could see the head wound.
Oh,
Really?
yes.
What do you remember about the brain?
Well, after they got him up on the autopsy table, I mean, I remember very little about the brain. I never saw any full brain. I mean a brain like you'd see in a diagram or medical school or a photograph or anything like that, because there was just so much of it that had been blown out.
So there was quite a bit
Yeah.
gone. Tell me a little bit about when they turned him over or lifted him up to look at the wound in the back. What was their thoughts on that?
Well, now this was when he was on the autopsy table. I mean, because they didn't look at that back wound until they had removed him out of the casket and placed him up onto the autopsy table. But when they did raise him up and they looked at the back, they noticed this wound in the back, and that's when they started probing with a rubber glove finger. And you had Dr. Humes, who was a chief pathologist, assisted by Dr. Boswell, another one from the medical center there. And then also you had Lieutenant Colonel Fink, F-I-N-C-K, from the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, which was part of the Walter Reed Hospital located there in Washington. And Fink used a chrome probe and used it in this back wound, and they all came to the conclusion there's no exit. Even when Humes probed it with the rubber glove finger, he said there's no exit that he could feel. So that's when I went over and made the call to the firearms lab, and they told me about this bullet being found on the stretcher, and I came back and related that information to the pathologist.
And what was their manner after you'd done that?
Well, as I say, Humes made this statement that this was probably, the bullet on the stretcher over there had probably worked its way out of the back during cardiac manipulation there at Parkland. And that accounted for that bullet and then tying it in with this back wound. Now, another thing, too, that I want to point out is that we recorded everybody that was there that came in that night. And when I was up the Assassination Records Review Board deposition in 1997, I was asked, did we pass a sheet around? And I said, oh, no, we obtained that individually from a person, or if I couldn't get to the person, someone standing next to you, and I would ask you, what's the person's name next to you? Do you know him? But we recorded. And I said that was evident in the fact that some of the names were misspelt. In other words, Admiral Berkeley, I spelled it B-E-R-K-L-E-Y, and it's B-U-R-K-L-E-Y. So he certainly wouldn't have misspelled his own name if he would have written it on a sheet of paper. And then they also gave us measurements of down from the back. I think it was so many centimeters on this bullet wound in the back, midline of the body and down below the shoulders. And that was placed, Boswell, in my recollection, was making most of the recordings on a face sheet that the pathologist used, showing markings of wounds and measurements and so forth. So, but that wound was definitely down in the lower back. And the thing that's perturbed me all this time is how they gradually moved this up to the base of the neck to have it come out the anterior neck and thus be a basis for the single bullet theory, which I've never believed, because I stood right there and was 2 feet from those wounds in the back, and I know where they were at.
You don't believe in the single bullet theory?
No, I told, when they called me from the Assassination Records Review Board, I forewarned them. I said, well, I'll tell you, I don't believe in the single bullet theory.
Well, the measurements that you put into your own notes were
given to us by Dr. Humes, or whoever made the measurements. That was another thing. I used to get calls from headquarters, and they'd say, now, is this your measurement, or is this your terminology? And I said, look, I wasn't a doctor there. I mean, everything that was put in our notes were obtained from the doctor's statements and his measurements. And then also, I told him that on any measurement, I always repeated it to the doctor to make sure that it was correct.
So those measurements that you have in your notes came from that night because the doctors specifically said these are the measurements.
That's right.
And you repeated it to them and they said it again.
Right.
So there's no mistaking
Oh,
the
yeah,
measurement.
I don't know whether they said it again, but I repeated it to them, and if they either said it or shook their head that was it, because I wanted to get those correct.
Any further memories that you want to talk about?
The only thing that we were given were two fragments that were placed in a small jar. It was with a black cap, a glass jar, probably about 2.5 inches tall. And on that, O'Neill and I scratched our initials through this black paint on the cap and the dates and everything. When I was up at the Assassination Records Review Board, they gave me this jar and asked me to identify it, and I was able to see my initials and everything and identified it as the jar that we had hand carried to the laboratory over there for any possible examination.
But these fragments were not large?
These fragments were so small that, well, I might say here too that one of the x-rays that they viewed there that night, that's another thing too, none of the photographs were developed that night. They were all packaged and we had nothing to do with those. Those were retained by Secret Service. But the autopsy, one of the slides there showed that it looked a lot like the Milky Way, and these were medical particles that showed up on the x-ray. And the two that were taken were removed, I think I don't remember, one back behind the eye, I think, and where they were removed from, and that was in my notes too. But they were of such small that there was no way you could make a comparison to compare with any bullet or anything of that nature.
Well, there was a receipt written for
Now,
missiles.
another thing I might mention too on this, that's right, there was a receipt and this was the cause of a lot of misapprehensions, I think, but the receipt said that O'Neill and I had accepted a missile, M-I-S-S-L-E, Now this receipt, and as I pointed out before the House Select Committee on Assassinations in '77 and the Assassinations Direct Review Board in '97, that was a receipt that was prepared by the Navy corpsman. It was given to us just to sign. And here again, I didn't. If this was happening after '65, I would say I'm not going to sign this receipt. It says missiles. These are fragments. Take it back and retype it. But I'm not about to make that statement in 1963, and so we signed it, and it said missile, but those were fragments. And of course, the other thing I wanted to mention too on this back wound, the measurements that were given, and the reason I don't buy the single bullet theory. First of all, it was moved up to the base of the neck for the Navy final autopsy report, whereas it was down below I was informed up there before the Assassination Records Review Board that had been changed from the official autopsy report, that wasn't there. I think Ford admitted that he's the only living member now of the Assassination Records Review Board, that he had made that change for clarification. And I laughed when I was beginning this deposition, and I said the only thing that clarifies would be the single bullet theory. But when the clothing now didn't come into the laboratory, into Bethesda that night, to the Navy Medical Center, the clothing from the president went over to the laboratory, the FBI lab. Later on, when they measured these bullet holes in the coat and the shirt, now I'm talking about the back of the shirt, not the front of the shirt, where this another one was in a nick of the on the necktie. It wasn't untied. I think it was just slit. The bow was still there, but they found the nick there. But the point I'm getting into, when they made the measurements over on the clothing, it was about 5 3/4 inches down from the top of the collar on the coat, and within 1/4 of an inch of the same on the shirt, which matched exactly the measurements that Boswell put on the face sheet and that Humes had given him that night.
Okay.
Now they said too, one book I read that the president was waving, and that might have pulled up his shirt and his coat. But you have to remember too that night the president was wearing a back belt that would have, if anything, would have kept the shirt tight, holding it down, and it certainly wouldn't move up that many inches. They can compare that with the Zapruder film too, and I don't know whether that would hold water.
My name is Dennis D. David, born and raised in Illinois. I went in the Navy when I was 17, retired when I was 39. November 1963, I was a hospital corpsman, first-class petty officer, stationed at the Naval Medical School, National Naval Medical Center in Bethesda. At this particular time, I was the leading corpsman, or the leading enlisted man in the Correspondence Training Division. And on the 22nd of November happened to be the day that I had the duty, which meant that I would be the chief of the day whenever we would set the watch, so to speak, or whenever everyone would go home after the normal day, and that would have been at 4 o'clock, 4:15. Well, on November 22nd, about noon, actually almost about 1 o'clock, I was reading a book and highlighting a book on hematology. Eddie Lewis, ensign in Medical Service Corps, was sitting right across from me on the desk. We got an FM radio listening to local FM, I guess what some of the kids today call elevator music, but it was classical, because Eddie and I loved classical music. All of a sudden, it comes on, President Kennedy's been shot in Dallas.
It's okay.
You'd think after 40 years. Anyway, so immediately, of course, we stopped what we were doing, and I started, we turned it up, and they said he'd been shot and been taken to Parkland Hospital. I got up and went upstairs on the second floor where we had some other training, occupational. This was in building 141, which was separate and apart from the main building. And the occupational therapist and the physical therapist training was up there. So I went up, ran in. I said, "Hey, the president's been shot." And Barb Monroe looked at me and she said, "David, that's not funny. Turn on the radio." And which she did. And we're all crying. I'm literally, like, tears running down. And then I went back down and sat in my office with Eddie until about hour and a half later, give or take. 2:30, I got a call, said that they were going to set the watch, which meant that anybody who was non-essential personnel, it was like the end of the day. And so I had to then take off, and I went over to the main building, to what was, that time was the finance liaison office in the basement. And we used it as the OD, COD, Chief of the Day office during off hours. And so I had checked my duty section to make sure everybody was there that was supposed to be. Most of them were over in Barracks 140, which was our barracks for the Naval Medical School. Then about, 1700 hours, 5 minutes after 5 in that evening, Dr. Boswell and I were in the OD's office, listening to the radio, like probably millions of others, or TVs, whatever. And the announcer came on and said that the body was being brought from Dallas to Bethesda for autopsy. And I remember looking at Dr. Boswell and said, going to be one hell of a night, which I didn't say exactly that way, but anyway, a little more extreme. And so he said, I said, "Shall I call the old man?" Meaning Captain Stover. He says, "Yeah, you better let him know." So I picked up the phone, I called Captain Stover, and Smokey said, "Yeah, David," he says, "I heard." He says, "I'm on my way in." And so then I told Dr. Boswell then that the captain was coming. About 5:30, I got a call from the Chief of the Day of the Naval Hospital. And he said, "David, can you come up?" He said, "There's some men up here that want to talk to us." I said, "Okay." So I go in up there, and there were 3 or 4 guys in suits, the blue suits as ties. I think his name was Ledbetter, was the Chief of the Chief of the Day for the Naval Hospital, and the Chief of the Day for the Naval Dental School was also there. And one of the suits identified himself, and I don't remember his name, couldn't tell you to this day, but he said, they're bringing the late president's body back, going to be autopsy, and you 3 have, or you represent the commands as enlisted men, have the spaces that'll be involved, and we want you to put guards on windows, doors, any possible means of outside access. And no one is to be allowed to come in that's not official or not supposed to be. If they're not in the duty section, it says if they're not part of your duty section, you're not to allow them in. Okay, fine. So I went back down below, and I called the barracks, and I figured out how many people I needed. Told them, I said, send them over to me. They came to my office, and I would put one on the east wing, the windows, some down, and the morgue was covered. That was handled, and any excess. The hospital, I sure did the same thing. The chief of the day, Ledbetter, did the same thing. Then I just, stayed there at about 6:30. No later than 6:35. I got a call that said, "Your visitor's on his way. We need some people to help offload." I said, "Fine." And they said, "He'll be there very shortly." So I called the barracks. I had 3 men left on the duty section. I called them and told the kid on duty I told the kid on duty at the barracks, I said, "Contact these 3 men, tell them to meet me at the morgue entrance ASAP, immediately." Then I called the chief of the dental school, and I don't remember, I called him by his first name because he was a good friend of mine. My wife worked at the dental school at the time, and so we'd gotten to be real good friends at that time. And I said, "Hey, have you got any extra help?" He said, "Yeah, what do you need?" I said, "I could use a couple." He said, he said, "How many?" And I said, "Well, 3. You got 3 men?" He said, "Sure." I said, "Well, have them meet me at the morgue entrance immediately." I said, "I need some things." When I got over there, within 5 or 6 minutes after all this, it was like maybe 20 till, all 6 of them showed up, myself, and we were standing just right inside the swinging doors that or the 2 big doors, not swinging doors, but the 2 double doors that opened out onto the loading dock or the jetty right outside the morgue. And it wasn't 2 or 3 minutes they arrived. This black hearse pulls in, backs up to the jetty, back door opens out, 4 or 5 guys in suits again get out of there. The driver and the guy running shotgun came out of the fronts and came up onto the jetty where I was standing. And the suits, and they pulled the door open, they backed the ambulance up, it already was there, and they pulled this gray shipping casket out, and I pointed at my men, I says, "All right, you 2 grab there, and you 2 in the middle, you 2 on the back, take it into the morgue." Well, then I walked into the hallway, immediately inside the doors. They took it in through the swinging doors that went into the anteroom of the morgue, and then a few seconds later, they came back out, and I said, "Okay, head on back to your barracks. If I need you, I'll give you a call." And the dental students, go back wherever you were supposed to be. And while they'd gone in there, I'd talked to the driver of the vehicle, and he commented that, and exactly how it came up I don't remember, but I do remember him saying that they'd come up 16th Street onto Jones Bridge Road and then came in to the compound off of the Jones Bridge Road, which would have been the back entrance at that time. As you come in, the Officers Club would have been on the left-hand side or the right-hand side. You come down, and here's the hospital quarters for the hospital, and then the road goes back on up like this, and the hospital, and here was the jetty, and then of course the road would go on around other places too. One of the things that stuck in my mind was that the ambulance driver and the guy that was with it were wearing civilian shoes, and they had on dark trousers, but an OR smock or a lab smock. If anybody's ever watched the ER on television and they see these doctors come out, this V-necked, short sleeve, with no collar, that's what they were wearing. And to be honest with you, I don't remember for sure whether it was green or white, but I remember that they were smocks of that nature. But the whole attitude of the 2, I don't think they were military. That was my whole impression that they were not. As soon as my boys came back out of the anteroom and I dismissed them, and the suits also had gone into that anteroom. And then I never saw them the rest of the evening. But the driver and the kid the guy that was with them, they went back out and took off with the hearse. Where they went, I don't know. I saw the lights come on. I saw them take off. And again, this was a black hearse. It was not an ambulance in the sense, because there was no running lights on. I mean, no siren, no emergency lights. It was exactly what you'd see in my time in the 50s and 60s or 40s at a funeral. Black in front of the funeral parade. So as soon as they, and when all this, after this, then I went back up front to the front of the hospital with the intent to go back down to the basement of the finance liaison to the chief days office and make my necessary log entries. And I stopped along the way as I went, checking my spaces and see my people were on duty and ask them if anything had happened, to find out, to make sure. And I went up on the second floor, and I went around the entrance to the main entrance to Naval Hospital, say like here, and then it's a two-story, and there is a walkway, or rather like a rotunda area, and I had gone around and was looking out the left-hand side through the window of a small office that was over in that corner at the humanity that was out in front. I was totally astounded. The driveway comes in off Wisconsin Avenue on one and makes a loop and goes back out on the lower down on Wisconsin. And the area in there was, they called it Bethesda Springs. From Wisconsin Avenue, or the edge of the Wisconsin Avenue to the edge of the driveway, probably 100 yards, 75 yards, maybe 100 yards, about like a football field. And that whole area within that arc, if you will, in Wisconsin Avenue, you couldn't see a blade of grass. There were so many people standing out there. There was, I recognized Shelby County Police. There was Bethesda Police vehicles. There was Montgomery County Police. There were Maryland State Police, motorcycles and vehicles lining that driveway. It's unbelievable. It was totally staggering, really. And while I was watching, I saw a gray ambulance pull in off of Wisconsin Avenue, pull into the driveway, and pull around up front. About that same time, there was a helicopter landed on a pad by the number 2 golf course right up there, which is close to that entrance. And several people got off the aircraft, off the helo, and at that time it was not easy to see because of light. It was getting very, it was kind of dark. But the impression was that they were military and enlisted. And to this day, I think that they may have been part of the National, or the Honor Guard that was appointed, which always happens for a president. But anyway, and then I turn around and almost immediately turn around and walk back, and I'm standing in the middle. I'm looking straight down, right at the front door, when Mrs. Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, and Mr. McNamara, who was Secretary of Defense. Those are the only three that I really remember for sure. And of course, Mrs. Kennedy in the pink dress with the pink pillbox hat, and blood all up and down her things. They walked across the lobby. I heard the elevator doors open, and I turned around and watched, like any elevator, they've got numbers above the door. I watched to go to the 17th floor. Then I went on and went back down to the finance liaison office and made notes so that I could write up the log at the end of the shift, whenever, at the end of the duty. The rest of the evening, I made rounds, probably about every hour, every 45 minutes to an hour. I was out walking around, checking spaces, making sure. I was down the morgue area several times because I always made that one of my stops on the way by. About 11 o'clock that evening, on one of the rounds, I was in the hallway outside the morgue. And I think he was, if I remember correctly, I think he was the administrative watch officer, Lieutenant MSC, Lieutenant JG MSC for the Medical Service Corps. And he was with a man in a blue suit. A lot of them were out there that night. And he come over and he said, "David, do you know anybody that can type and has a security clearance?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm a mat tech. And I'm also, I have a security clearance up to and including secret." And then he turned and introduced me to this guy. And by mat tech, which is a medical administrative tech, he knew, that I could type, or supposed to be able to. And so the man in the suit, he was FBI, I believe. He said, "I need to type up something. Where can we do it?" And I said, "Well, we can go up to the AO's office, the med school AO's office." And I says, "I can type it up," because I had worked in that office prior to going over to correspondence training, so I was well aware. So I went in and I sat down. He dictated, "To whom it may concern," it was a memo, "to whom it may concern" type memo with the date and everything, that the following items or particles were removed from the head of President John F. Kennedy during postmortem. The exact wording I can't remember, but it described 4 pieces of lead, 2 centimeters by 4 centimeters by 1 centimeter, 3 centimeters by 4 centimeters by 2 centimeters, etc. Described all 4 of them. And when I finished typing it, the agent reached over, pulled the memo out of the typewriter, and began proofing it, reading it. And while he'd been dictating, he had set down a pill vial on the desk right beside me where I was typing. And when he pulled the memo out, I picked this vial up and was looking at it. He said, "Go ahead if you want to look at them." So I uncapped them, poured them out, and there were 4 pieces of lead that looked to me like they were from a bullet. Believe me, I know what a bullet looks like. And there was too much. These 4 pieces constituted too much to be 1 bullet. There may not have been enough there for 2, but there damn sure was too much for 1. So then, and he finished proofreading him, and then he laid it down and he signed the memorandum, and I put him back in the vial, capped it. He took the vial and stuck it in his pocket. Then he reached over and he flipped the top on the IBM Selectric typewriter and took the tape cartridge out. And at the time I thought it was funny because, what the heck? But then I realized that they use kind of a carbon tape, and it's only used once, and it leaves on there. You could tape that tape and see what memorandum had been typed. Then when he took this and he had the papers and the carbons and everything, he looked at me and he said, "Now he said, this is to be considered as classified documents and be treated as such," which told me, you keep your mouth shut, you don't tell anybody what you saw or what you said, or what was on here. After that, I just continued to make rounds the rest of the evening. About 3 o'clock in the morning, I went down to the snack bar, which was open. And there was 6 or 7 or more listed guys like me in there. We were having coffee, kind of unwinding and talking about what was going on among ourselves, because we were all, and even at that time they said, "Hey, did you know there was two ambulances or 2 caskets?" I said, "Not." No, I said, I only know one that came in. And then some guy says, yeah, and he says, you know, that they brought a brain in through the entrance to the emergency room at the hospital, put it in an nemesis basis, put it on a gurney, and took it down to the morgue. You know, this is the type of thing that was already floating around at that particular time. And somebody said, well, you know, well, why two caskets? And one guy said, well, something about they were afraid to, would be kidnapped. And somebody else said, no, it was they just wanted to avoid all the morbid, you know, like all those people that were out on the front lawn speaking out in front of the things. And that, you know, I can't verify what it was, but that's what the rumors was going around. And finally, about 6 o'clock, I think I went up 5:30. I finally went and laid down in the chief of days room, and about 6:30, I got up. You know, I couldn't say. Got up. I wrote up my log, and got it ready, and then took it into Boswell. Took it up to him to sign it, and then he would be. And then on Monday, when Captain Stover would come in, the logs would be taken to him for approval, if you will, or final reading. And then about, I guess about 8:30 and 9 o'clock, I went home, and I lived in Frederick, Maryland, which is about 35 miles northeast or northwest of Bethesda. That Saturday evening then, I'm sitting in my living room with my wife watching TV when I see this photo now of them offloading this fancy bronze casket at Andrews Air Force Base. And I looked at Doc and I said, that's a bunch of hogwash. I said, that isn't the casket we got. And she said something to me like, you know, are you supposed to talk about it or something to that effect? But you could with her, you know. But I said, you know, that's not the casket that we offloaded. And it wasn't until a lot later I found out more about it. But so Monday we went back to work, and I heard through the grapevine on the rumors that anybody who had been in the morgue that night had been called up to Captain Stover's office and had been required to sign a statement or an affidavit of some kind. I had no idea what it was. That if they talked about what had transpired on Friday, they would be court-martialed or could be court-martialed under the UCMJ, Uniform Code of Military Justice, as a you know, for violating classified act, Classified Information Act. And I never signed that. I was never asked to sign that. As I said, the only warning I ever had been on that evening when he, after I typed that memorandum when the FBI agent told me it was to be treated as classified. At sometime either, I think it was on Tuesday, I happened to run into Dr. Boswell in the hallway. So I said something to him. I said, you know, what was all that bit with the two caskets? I said, which casket was the body of the president went in? He said, well, you should know, you were there. And I said, but, you know, and I was only there for one casket delivery. I never did lay eyes on a bronze casket. Never have. The only time I ever saw it was on TV.
So let me understand this. Boswell knew about the so-called shipping casket. He was there.
That would be my interpretation, because he told me that I was there when the president's body came in. And as I said, I was only there for one casket. I might add also that, you know, on that Friday night, there was all kinds of brass and blue suits running around. I know that Admiral Kenny was there. I saw him. I saw Admiral Galloway. I saw Captain Stover. I did see Humes and, of course, Boswell. Admiral Berkeley. Admiral Kenny, who was Surgeon General of the Navy. and the Surgeon General of the Army that I recognized. Those people, I knew their faces, I knew who they were. There was also an Air Force general there wearing medical insignia, and I assumed that he was Surgeon General of the Air Force. And there was some other line brass. And by that I mean, in the Navy, line officers or people that command ships and everything have a star on their sleeve, just above the gold around. And there was some line officers, some admirals, vice admirals, rear admirals, and some others. Who they were, I have no idea. I don't know that I ever did know who they were. On Monday afterwards, or Tuesday, I don't remember the exact date, I stopped in the audiovisual department of the Naval Medical School, which was in a separate building. Navy Exchange had part of it, and the audiovisual. And the head of that division was a guy named Lieutenant Commander William Bruce Pitzer, Medical Service Corps. I walked in, and I just, hit the doorknob, walked right into his office. Bill looked up, he says, "Come over here." I walked over, he's got a film editor, one of those, not an expensive one, just kind of a cheap film editor, hand crank, and he's looking at a 16 millimeter film of the autopsy. He also had some black and white photos and some color photos of the late president. And, we looked at it, we were kind of aghast at the size of the wound, but I know that his impression from what the pictures we were looking at was the same as mine, that there was an entry wound here, right about here, and an exit wound back here, about like that. It wasn't round, it wasn't exactly rectangular, but it was irregularly rectangular. But it just looked like this whole back was just completely blown out. And saw a gash across here in this area that I later found out was supposed to have been, one of the doctors. And then they said, that they had attempted to put a trach tube in. I remember one of the things that amazed me was that was a sloppy job, because it was almost a 2-inch incision.
Hello, my name is Paul O'Connor. November the 22nd, 1963, I was a student in the National Naval Medical Center Lab School. About noontime, we found out that President Kennedy had been wounded in Dallas, Texas, and a short time later found out that he had passed away. At that time, what happened was that the school command closed down. Everybody that had duty went to their duty station, and everybody that didn't have duty went home. Well, myself and Mr. Curtis Jenkins and I had the duty that night in the morgue. So we went down to the morgue, checked our supplies, see if everything was okay for the weekend. Had no idea that we were going to have anybody come in that night. And all of a sudden, Admiral Galloway showed up. Now, Admiral Galloway was chief of the medical school command. He asked my name, and I told him. He asked Jenkins' name, and the same thing. And he said, "Gentlemen," he says, "you're now confined to the morgue." He says, "You have a very important visitor coming tonight." Well, at that time, it hit us. We were going to get JFK. Well, as the night wore on, the morgue started filling up with people. admirals, generals, a lot of people in what I call suits, official-looking people. Some I recognized, most of them I didn't. Around, I think it was 8 o'clock. I'm not really quite sure on the time. Doors opened up. 6 men came in with a cheap shipping casket, set it down by the first table, and left real quick. And we opened it up. Inside was a body bag. We unzipped the body bag, and inside was a body. We took the body and placed it on the table. The head was wrapped in a bloody sheet. The rest of the body had sheets on it. We unwrapped the sheet, and we had no idea of what we were going to find when we did this. And it was JFK. And my first thought as I looked down at the body, the head wound, was there was a monstrous hole in his head, and it stretched from his hairline all the way through his temple area, down around to the occipital area and parietal area. It was all gone, and I could see clear down to the bottom of his cranium. And like I said, the first thought that came to my mind is it looked like a bomb had gone off inside his head. The damage was that great. We also noticed that he had a jagged looking wound in his neck. Now, come to find out that that was a tracheotomy scar. But I'd never seen a tracheotomy scar that sloppily done. Years later, as I talked to one of the Dallas doctors, he told me that that was a bullet entrance wound, and that he had taken his scalpel and cut through the hole, bullet hole, in order to get the airway established in the Kennedy's lungs. That bullet, if it entered the throat, I have no idea where it went, because there was no exit wounds in the back or arms or anything. Later, as we were checking the body over, we turned him over, found another bullet wound, an entrance wound, and if most people would feel their back, they'll feel a little lump in their spinal column. That's called C7, or 7th cervical vertebrae. And the wound, the hole was down and about 3 inches to the right of that vertebrae. That wound, the bullet from that didn't come through the body anywhere. Now, when we did the autopsy, and the autopsy was a very strange autopsy. I've never done one like this before or since. The doctors opened up the body, and what they call Christmas treating. They cut all the jugular veins, the carotid arteries, and so did the same thing with down below, and removed all of his organs intact at one time. At that time, I noticed, as I looked into the body, I saw blood in the intercostal muscles, or the muscles between the ribs, that were all bloody. And I thought, well, what happened is that must have been from damage from the bullet that hit him in the back. Now, I've been in the service quite a long time and with the Marine Corps, and we used to go out on the range and fire a lot of old ammunition, and sometimes you get bad powder. And when they fire this ammunition, the bullet didn't have the velocity to punch through where it is going to. And that's what I figured happened, is they had some bad powder in this bullet. Because I remember Dr. Fink, the Army doctor that was helping Dr. Humes and Dr. Boswell, probed it with a metal probe, and it only went in so far, arched downward, and you can see where it actually penetrated the intercostal muscles and hit the back of the pleural cavity, the pleura, which lines the lungs. And that bullet did not pass through the body. As far as the head wounds are concerned, there was no definition of entry or exit. It was just a big, jagged, nasty hole in his head. Like I said, I thought a bomb had gone off. I've never seen. And another thing is that the rest of his skull was fractured, comminuted fractured. That means it was a lot of little fractures. And so it looked like a tremendous amount of force had struck him, and that whatever projectile they used was a huge projectile. It had to be. And we worked that night, all night on him. Like I said, it was a strange autopsy. We had Admiral Berkeley in the room. Admiral Berkeley was the president's physician. He was on the phone constantly with Bobby Kennedy upstairs. They had taken Bobby and Jackie and brought them to the hospital. And this was later I found this out. And took them up to the presidential suite of the hospital. And Bobby was telling Admiral Berkeley what to do and what not to do as far as his body was concerned, and working on the body. And also found out that Jackie did not want an autopsy done, and that Admiral Berkeley had talked her into a small autopsy, a modified autopsy, he said, whatever that means. But we'd start to do something, and he'd say, leave that alone, don't touch that, don't touch this. Now, the throat wound, we were going to probe it, and he said, leave it alone, that's just a tracheotomy. And we left it alone. It seemed like that there were important issues like the bullet wound in the back that should have been addressed more, that were glossed over and just forgot about. Like I said, the head wound, I don't remember seeing any bullets or bullet fragments. Now, as I understand later on, and you have to remember the morgue was completely full of people, that they had found pieces of bone and also fragments of metal and brought them into the morgue. Where I don't know. And I did see the pieces of bone, and they were skull bone. Since the head was all fractured and destroyed, we had to fill the cranium with plaster of Paris, and then we just put the pieces of bone over the top of the plaster of Paris. And at that time, the organs were put back in the body. As I can remember, after 40 years, things were getting a little fuzzy. So, pardon me for not being so sharp on everything. There was a funeral home called Goller's Funeral Home in Washington, D.C., and I found out that they were one of the most prominent funeral homes in Washington, D.C. They also, I understand, embalmed Abraham Lincoln, which was very interesting to find out. They came in, and myself and Mr. Jenkins, just stayed around and helped them. Everybody else, after the autopsy was done, had left. Mr. Jenkins and I didn't have anything to do, so we helped with the dressing of the body, which was incredible. I started working in a funeral home when I was in 8th grade of high school, and I saw what they did when they dressed the deceased. The people would bring in the best coat, the best suit or the best dress, and we'd cut it right down the back, and half of it would be dressed over one half of the body and half on the other side of the body, and then tucked in the back. And the reason we did that is that rigor mortis sets in and you can't move the limbs. Not so with President Kennedy. We completely dressed him, and believe me, that was extremely hard to do. I'm talking about a long sleeve shirt, a coat, a tie, trousers, socks, and we even put his shoes on. I'd never seen, in all my years in the funeral business, anybody being buried with their shoes on. We never did it. And somebody told me that the suit was his inaugural suit. His shoes were the shoes that he used when he was inaugurated also. They were beautiful shoes. And they did a wonderful job. They were able to cover up the wound area completely. One thing I could say is that if it was Eisenhower, we would have been in trouble, because Eisenhower had no hair, but JFK had a bunch of hair, very thick, and he just so happened he combed it over to the right, which that's where the wound was. And they were able to get that fixed so that you couldn't even see that he had been hit by a missile or anything. We then placed him in a large mahogany casket. And at that time, I guess it was around 8 o'clock in the morning. We've been going all night with this. And the last thing, I guess, that we did a person did. He came up, this man in a suit came up and he says, "Is your name O'Connor?" And I said, "Yes." He says, "You must be Catholic." He says, and he handed me a rosary. And he says, "Put this rosary in his hands like you Catholics hold the rosaries." Well, number one, I wasn't Catholic, and I had no idea how the Catholics held their rosary. So I just twined it around his hands. The cover was closed and the casket was taken out, and that was the end of my experience with the assassination of JFK.
My name is James Jenkins. I was at Bethesda. I was a hospital corpsman. I was in their laboratory blood bank. The duty at that time was every fourth night I took duty in the morgue assisting with autopsies. It just happened to fall that on that evening after the assassination, I had the duty. And I was, my partner at that time was Paul, and I'm not really sure of why Paul was my partner, but because he and I were not normally partnered, but he may have traded with somebody. And we assisted with the autopsy. I primarily assisted Dr. Boswell. I did cover sheets, which are in the archives and are also shown in the Warren Commission report.
Tell me from the beginning of when you first realized that you were going to be receiving the body of John Kennedy.
Well, I think I first realized that, or had an idea, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. We were in class, and Bill Lynch, who was our, I guess, petty officer in charge of the students, we had a break, small break, 15-minute break, and he came back and he was telling me that John Kennedy had been assassinated and so forth. Bill was kind of a jokester, so I wasn't paying much attention to him. And then the instructor came in and told us that classes were dismissed and that whoever had morgue duty was to report to the morgue. So at that time, I knew something was going on. I didn't really know for sure that what was happening. So Paul and I went to the morgue, and we started preparing the morgue like we would normally do, by labeling specimen jars, filling out, or getting together the toe tags, things of that nature that we would normally use. And I'm not real sure of when I first saw, or when the body came in, because I don't really, I'm not time orientated, and I really wasn't paying much attention to the time after I got in the morgue. The body came in. I remember seeing the first part of the casket as it came through the antrum door, but I didn't really pay much attention to it after that. I didn't really have very much to do with the removal of the body from the casket until it got to the table. And then whenever it was put on the table, it was still wrapped in sheets, and we were told not to unwrap it until Dr. Boswell, Dr. Humes got there. And I believe Dr. Boswell came in first, I'm not sure. And he and I did the face sheet. He measured the body, dictated the measurements in the face sheet, the rest of the face sheet to me. And but the head was still wrapped at that time. And so then Dr. Humes and Dr. Fink came in, and Dr. Humes unwrapped the head. The head was, I remember it being wrapped in some towels under the sheet. And it was, I remember that because Dr. Humes took the towels and threw them over against the wall, actually over in the, kind of in the corner up against the wall. And I thought to myself, I got to clean that up. But the wound, or the head, it was a mess. The hair still had blood matted. It was down. The head itself, there was a lot of tissue in the scalp and bone attached to the hair, and like I said, it was just kind of hanging on the morgue table, and it. We did X-rays first. After that, we set him up, took AP laterals, X-rayed the head, and we did that several times. I mean, we did it, and then we came back, and then we did it again, and then the radiologists came in, and they used some view boxes on the back of the wall at the morgue to look at X-rays, and everybody was excited and upset and so forth, and the gallery was all tense, and at that time we weren't finding anything. We didn't, we found no bullet fragments, and everybody was assuming that we either weren't doing our job, which is what I assumed at that time, or we didn't know what we were doing. But later on, I began to realize that wasn't the case. It was we weren't finding what they wanted us to find. And Dr. Fink and Dr. Humes were examining the head, and I was on Dr. Fink's right side. He was actually at the head of the table. I was at the side of the table. And he found an area right above the right ear that was a small hole, actually. And when I say small hole, it was a small hole, but it had fractures radiating out from it. And so he started examining it and showed it to Dr. Humes, and they were discussing some kind of a bluish gray material that was around the edge of that toward the front of the head, and they speculated it might be lead from a bullet. And then we kind of just went away from it. I mean, it seemed to pique no interest anymore. And then they were examining the back of the head, okay. And then they left the head area, and I helped Dr. Humes. We did a wide incision and removed the organs, which is common, the way we always did it. We tied off subclavian and the renals and the aorta ascending, and actually took the bodies out, the organs out intact. And at the table, we had kind of a table that went over the body, and Dr. Boswell examined the heart. At Bethesda, we didn't really sausage the heart. What we did was that we opened it up and looked at it. It looked really healthy. The lungs, the lungs were really pink. I mean, they were, because I remember a conversation between the gallery and the floor saying, did he smoke? And the comment was he smoked a few cigars. And the only thing we found was on the upper right lobe of the lung, in the back port, in the anterior portion, there was a discoloration, a bluish mark. And then I noticed that Humes was probing the wound in the back with his finger. And I thought, you know, that's not going to work very well, because Humes was a big man, had fairly large hands. But I could see the imprintation of his finger as it went down on the pleural cavity. And, you know, I could actually see as it went down, and it went down and stopped. And Fink says, well, let's use a sound. And I don't know if they had to go get a sound or whatever, but they did. They took a sound, and they probed it, and it dead end. It was a dead end. And at one time, I thought that they were going to actually force the sound through the pleural wall into the cavity. And the other thing that was kind of unusual about it was the fact is there was very little additional blood in the pleural cavity at all. That, you know, that you would expect that there'd be a lot of blood in there, but there was very little. And you know, we did that.
Why is it significant that there was very little blood?
Well, the nature of the wounds, for one thing. I mean, if it's just, you know, if this in truth was something other than you know, a trach, you would probably expect, you know, to have blood in the lungs themselves. And then in the pleural cavity with that type of trauma, if, you know, if that had gone all the way through the way that they said, it would have had to have come from here up to here. So I would have thought that, you know, there would be bleeding into the pleural cavity and so forth. Of course, you know, that's just my opinion and conjecture. The other thing that we, you know, the man was really fairly healthy in the sense that, you know, Dr. Humes examined the intestines, which is, well, was a little unusual because most of the time I had to do that. But we found nothing there. The kidneys looked pretty good. I think the adrenals were a little. I think later on I heard that they had a little atrophy or something in them, and then they took the testicles, because that was a procedure where you actually went down and through from the inside, and I always felt like that. I mean, that at the time seemed to be a little painful to me, perspective, I guess, wise. But you know, and then after most of that was, most of that was going on, Humes and Fink were just, you know, looking at the head, examining the fractures, going, you know, they were looking at x-rays, that type of stuff. And then when Dr. Boswell came back to the table, you know, and when we finished with the organs were placed in the basin. It was a basin, and they had taken sections, and or Dr. Boswell had taken sections, and we'd put them in the little jars and stuff. And then they started actually opening up the head. They, you know, they had pretty much separated the hair and that type of thing, and had examined the wound and so forth, and they had kind of put everything back together, and at that point in time, I was fairly surprised that all of that massive looking damage actually constituted a small, I'm not sure of diameter, probably no more than 3/4 of an inch hole that was close to the occipital, where the occipital bone margins come in a protuberance, and then laying almost in an area adjacent to the central or sagittal suture. It came in, but it did not
Show
cross.
me where that is on your head.
Right here. And it didn't cross into the side. And in this area here, it was kind of a jagged area, and the fact is that it came out, and it looked like there was bone missing here, and then there was bone, well, actually, I think it's a little farther back. There was bone missing in an area about that size, but everything else fitted back. And after that, there was a lot of tension in the room, and there was a lot of tension from the gallery. Humes, in this area in here, there was, I don't really know whether it was a tear or what, but it looked like it had been, there was a fractured area here in the jagged area that looked like it had been surgically extended, and to be able to open up the total wound itself and expand that. And Humes was removing the brain, and his comment, and he made this muttering comment like something similar to, well, the damn thing almost fell out of my hands. And there was Humes and Fink. Boswell was standing on Humes's left, and I was right across the table from Boswell. And Humes turned to the gallery and says, "Was there any surgery done at Parkland?" And that did not go well. There were no real verbal comments that came, but it was like, you don't have any business asking that, or whatever. And so he was finally told no. And he gave the brain to Boswell. And Boswell and I went over to the bucket, and there was and we were having problems getting the needles. The way we infused brains at Bethesda was we had a carboy that set up on the shelf that was filled with formalin. And we had a tube that came from that, had a Y, and we had two surgical needles attached to it. And we'd put those in to the carotids, internal carotids at the base of the brain. And we would tie with suture silk, let them sit for 3 or 4 hours. And then later on, we would drop that brain into the bucket, which had formalin in it. Was a steel bucket with a gauze sling in it. And we were having problems doing that because the vessels had retracted. And at first, it looked like from trauma, but then as you were trying to deal with them, I had a pair of hemostats, and then I realized that they weren't torn. Apparently they had been cut quite some time, prior to this. Or at least that was my indication because of what my observations. Usually vessels like that, because they are, muscular and so forth, they'll retract a little bit. And there was one of the residents, and I don't remember what his name was, but I can picture him. He had fairly tight curly hair, and had a dark, swarthy complexion, and he was kind of thin. And later on, I was told that he was the chief resident at that time, but I don't know. I didn't know him.
And what's his significance?
Oh, he helped us get the needles in the brain infusion. The last time I saw the brain was about 9 o'clock in the morning when I left the morgue. And I went back to the morgue about, I guess about 45 minutes or an hour later, and everything was gone. The logbooks was gone. The bucket was moved, and I just assumed they had picked the bucket up and put it in the brain room. And, but I never really thought much about it.
The brain room, did they have a special room where they kept specimens?
Yeah, you had the morgue was, you had the large room was a morgue, and then there was kind of a hallway. And then on the left side, there was a specimen room. And on the right side, there was laundry room, I think, or something like. And then the back of it was where the lockers and, the clothes were changed, had a shower back there, and, just for us to change clothes, clean up before we came out. And what they did was they would take the autopsies that we did, the brains from those autopsies, and on Monday mornings, I believe it was Monday, they had brain conference where they would take the residents and whomever was interested in a certain case, and then they would dissect the brains and examine them. And like I said, I just assumed that that's where it went. And other than that, after the brain was removed and fused, I think there were some more photographs taken. Then the mortician washed the body on the table, washed the hair. Then he actually embalmed and shaped the body on the table. Then they moved it after the body was clean and dried and so forth. They moved it to the other autopsy table and did the cosmetics on it and dressed him.
Were you around for the cosmetics on the body? And
Yes, I didn't leave the morgue. I went into the morgue about 3:15, and I didn't leave until 9 o'clock the next morning. And most of the time, I was at that table, and Dr. Stover was sitting behind me in a chair, and he was in scrubs, but he didn't participate in the autopsy. And what he was doing, I don't know, sometime in the morning after we were kind of finished, he told me to go get something to eat, and they had brought some sandwiches in, and actually brought them in and put them in the specimen room. So I walked back there, took my gloves off, washed my hands, and picked up a sandwich, had a couple of bites, and threw it in the trash can, went back to the table. I had to be within hearing distance of the doctors that were there, because they were, my job was really to help them and get them, if they needed something. And like I said, I wasn't allowed to leave the morgue until about 9 o'clock that morning. Then I was taken to Stover's office, and I was given orders from Secretary of the Navy and Department of Defense that I was not to discuss anything with them. And you know, there were some things that I remember. You know, I remember kind of a scuffle back in or a disturbance back toward the door to the atrium. It's kind of in the area where the honor guard was sitting. It's kind of the morgue. The morgue had a gallery, and the gallery was like kind of like bleachers. It went up, and later on, I asked what went on because I didn't see, and they said, well, someone had a camera and they'd taken it away from him. Most of my focus was on that table, and the tension and so forth, and was basically coming from Galloway and Kennedy's position, and they were, most of those people standing in that area right there behind, or actually to the side of us, were flag officers. You know.
What does that mean, flag officer?
They were admirals and generals and so forth. There were some civilians there. I remember seeing, I think it was Ted Kennedy. He came in, but he came in high in the gallery and stayed for a few minutes and left. But that was just, you know, just a glimpse, because he was in, you know, the table is here, I was here, and the gallery was here. So I could see pretty much straight across from me. But I wasn't paying much attention to down at the other end, the morgue. It's really a shame the morgue doesn't exist anymore, because the morgue could give you a much better perspective on what everything was there and so forth. And the morgue was an atrium type thing that came in out of the hallway, and that's where the cool boxes were. That's where the body boxes were, and that's where we signed everybody in and tagged them. And then you came from that into the morgue proper, and you had two autopsy tables. The one that there was, as you came in, there was an autoclave on your left, and then the first autopsy table, and then the second autopsy table. We very rarely used the first one. We almost always used the second one. And then there was the end of the gallery. There was a portable x-ray machine that sat there all the time. And then there was another door that went back out into the hallway. And then the passageway or the hallway that it was a very short hall, that was on the other side of the morgue and went back, that had the specimen room and the dirty room, and then in the back of that was the lockers and shower and stuff.
What about you've said that there was a major or a colonel that was supposed to have been brought in at some point?
Well, when I first got into the morgue, there was a casket that came in on a gurney. It's actually one of those folding gurney things. And I asked the first class, who was our officer of the day in the lab, in the medical part of it up there, what there was, because I was going to log him in. And he said, well, don't bother to log him in. He said that he was an Army major or something, I believe he was, not an Air Force major or someone, that they were going to bury in Arlington the next day, but he had come in too late to get into Arlington. And I thought that was a little strange because that never happened to us before, and us not logging him in was even stranger because, you know, that was a cardinal sin not to.
That was always part of the procedure to log.
Oh yeah, I mean everything that came to that morgue had to have the paperwork done, and had to have the paperwork done exactly in a format, and we didn't log it in, and so we pushed it right in front of the cooler boxes, and I went into the morgue, but I don't specifically remember where it was there the next morning when I left or not. And I don't remember anybody coming to take it away. And, you know, there's been some conjecture, and I can't really refute it or confirm. The fact is that may have been the casket that they used to put him in, because I don't remember him ever bringing a separate casket into the morgue through the doors or anything. And Paul can probably tell you more about that than I can. But, you know, there were some honor guard with him. I mean...
with that particular casket?
No, I didn't see any honor guard with that casket.
When you talk about the honor guard, who was the honor guard with?
With the casket that came in, well, with the body in it, with Kennedy's body in it. They were, you knew they were honor guard because they were in formal dress uniform for their services. I think most of them were Army. I don't remember any Marines or no Navy that I remember, and they would just seem to be just enough to carry the casket as pallbearers, and they stayed most of the night.
Where did they stay?
They were sitting in the gallery.
They were in the gallery.
Yeah, I think that, you know, I remember things that I directly participated in, and I remember things that I thought that were a little unusual. But the casket, supposedly with the colonel or with the major in it, was extremely unusual. And but I didn't really, you know, I wish I'd have been maybe a little bit more inquisitive, but I was fairly young in the service, doing exactly what I was told to do. And so I was told not to log it in. I didn't log it in, and certainly there was no way I was going to look in it. I do remember the brain. I remember the brain because I looked at the brain and I thought there's not enough damage to justify or to be rectified with the amount of damage to the skull. And there was, the damage seemed to be in this area of the brain. The brain was kind of, in that area was kind of gelled, and some of it was missing. I didn't notice any excessive damage to the rear of the brain, to the pons or anything of that nature, the brainstem. The only other thing I remember about the brainstem was that when we were handling the brains, the brainstem had been cut, And I thought it was a little strange that it seemed like it had been cut from two sides. It was, I don't know, what I mean is that if you take something and you know, and you cut it from one side and then you turn around and cut it from the other side, it's never going to be straight across. And then, if I remember correctly, let's see, he was having turned. It would have been the right side. The right side seemed to be just a little bit lower than the left.
Do you remember specifically the brain coming out of the head, or were you handed the brain and that's what you saw? You were just handed?
Humes was standing there, and the brain, you know, I've been asked this question before. There was no way that I could see that Humes had that brain anywhere else. There was no place for it to be unless he had it in his pocket, which he didn't. And the brain was coming out of the head. And he took the brain after he was a little surprised by the brain, I think. And then he picked it up and gave it to Dr. Boswell. And like I said, I had some impressions that, again, the brain was small, and that the convolutions or sulci in the brain seemed to be smoother in normal form, and wider spaced.
What's the significance of that?
I don't know. My impression was that it was like, it looked more like a woman's brain. And, but there's no scientific basis for that I'm aware of, that I've been able to find. But I did feel like it was small. I felt like the damage was a little incongruent with the damage to the skull. And, you know, people have said there was a third of the brain gone. I think it was just an area. I mean, there was part of the brain, but the brain itself had kind of, I mean, on the area where the trauma was, had kind of gelled. And it was soft because of the damage, I assume. And it wasn't symmetrical anymore, but I didn't, like I said, I didn't feel like there was a major portion of the brain gone. I certainly didn't. I mean, the brain wasn't open to the point where you could see the corpus callosum or the ventricles or anything of that nature, which was later described, I think. And so I don't know. You know, I've been asked, did I think that was Kennedy's brain? I don't really have any reason to believe that it wasn't. I think it's probably just my perspective at that night. And I do feel like that the brain had been removed, examined at some earlier time from, you know, just kind of putting together the pieces of what I saw. You know, the wound itself, even though, as I described, well, that's conjecture on my part, but the wound that that night that I thought would be described as the exit wound had been either torn or expanded to where you could probably have taken your hand, taken that wound, and opened it up, and and removed the brain. That was, and again too, this is my perspective, because, I didn't consider the fractionation of the skull and so forth to be the actual exit area. You know, even though, because everything was being held together by hair and scalp that was adhered to the bone, except for the areas where the bone was gone. And, you know, that was the area. Now, the other question I've been asked is, you know, did we find any bullet fragments? No, we didn't find anything. You know, they got away with this huge hoax. And without anybody really, I mean, without any of the population banding together in you know, in questioning this. You know, you had people in the streets, you know, with protesting against Vietnam, and you had all of these organizations against Vietnam or against war and all that stuff, but yet you had a third world assassination within your own country, and nobody seemed to care.